Okay, so I just did a reading of Agrarian Justice down on Pandora Street. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I felt anywhere else wasn't quite good enough. Because what's happening there is basically enclosure. When you see a sweep, when you see sections of the grass, literally, like Leonard Cohen would say, the fields are under lock and key, then, like Paine explained, the land, the earth, should be the property of all human beings. But of course, we've changed that. You can't have society and not have that happen at the same time. So something has to make up the difference to make it, as he explained, agrarian justice. It also comes up in the writings of Henry George. It also comes up in John Locke's writing of the Lockean Proviso. So that's the reason for it. And enjoy. Agrarian Justice by Thomas Spence. To preserve the benefits of what is called civilized life, and to remedy at the same time the evil which it has produced, ought to be considered as one of the first objects of reformed legislation. Whether that state that is proudly, perhaps erroneously, called civilization has most promoted or most injured the general happiness of man is a question that may be strongly contested. On one side, the spectator is dazzled by the splendid appearances. On the other, he is shocked by the extremes of wretchedness, both of which it has erected. The most affluent and the most miserable of the human race are to be found in the countries that are called civilized. To understand what the state of society ought to be, it is necessary to have some idea of the natural and primitive state of man, such as it is at this day among the Native Americans of North America. There is not in that state any of those spectacles of human misery which poverty and want present to our eyes in all the towns and streets of Europe. Poverty, therefore, it is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. It exists not in the natural state. On the other hand, the natural state is without the advantages which flow from agriculture, arts, science, and manufactures. The life of the Native American is a continual holiday compared with the poor of Europe, and, on the other hand, it appears to be abject when compared to the rich. Civilization, therefore, or that which is so called, has operated two ways: to make one part of society more affluent and the other part more wretched. That would have been the lot of either in a natural state. It is always possible to go from the natural to the civilized state, but it is never possible to go from the civilized to the natural state. The reason is that man in a natural state, subsisting by hunting, requires 10 times the quantity of land to range over to procure himself sustenance that would support him in a civilized state where the earth is cultivated. When, therefore, a country becomes populous by the additional aids of cultivation, art, and science, there is a necessity of preserving things in that state, because without it, there cannot be sustenance for more, perhaps, than a tenth of its inhabitants. The thing, therefore, now to be done is to remedy the evils and preserve the benefits that have arisen to society by passing from the natural to that which is called the civilized state. In taking the matter upon this ground, the first principle of civilization ought to be, and ought to still be, that the condition of every person born into the world after the state of civilization commences ought to not be worse than if he had been born before that period. But the fact is that the condition of millions in every country in Europe is far worse than if they had been born before civilization began, had been born amongst the Native Americans of North America at the present. I will show how this fact has happened. It is a position not to be controverted that the earth, in its natural cultivated state, was and ever would have been, continued to be, the common property of the human race. It is a state every man would have been born to property. He would have been a joint life proprietor with the rest in the property of the soil, and in all its natural productions, vegetable and animal. But the earth in its natural state, as before said, is capable of supporting but a small number of inhabitants compared to what it is capable of doing in a cultivated state. And And as it is possible to separate the improvement made by the cultivation of the earth from the earth itself, upon which that improvement is made, the idea of landed property arose from that parable of connection. But it is nevertheless true that it is the value of the improvement only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor, therefore, of cultivated lands owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land of which he holds. And it is from this ground rent that the fund proposed in this plan is to issue. It is deducible as well from the nature of the thing as from all the stories transmitted to us that the idea of landed property commenced with cultivation, and that no such thing as landed property before that time. It could not exist in the first state of man, that of hunters. It did not exist in the second state, that of shepherds. Neither Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, nor Job, so far as the history of the Bible may be credited in probable things, were owners of land. Their property consisted, as is always enumerated, in flocks and herds, that they traveled with them from place to place. The frequent contentions at the time about the use of a well in the dry country of Arabia, where those people lived, also show that there was no landed property. It was not admitted that land could be claimed as property. There could be no such thing as landed property originally. Man did not make the earth, and though he had every natural right to occupy it, he had no right to locate it as his property in perpetuity, any part of it. Neither did the creator of the earth open a land office from whence the first title deeds should issue. Whence then arose the idea of landed property? I answer as before, that when cultivation began, the idea of landed property began with it, from the impossibility of separating the improvement made by the cultivation of the earth itself, upon which that improvement was made. The value of the improvement so far exceeded the value of the natural earth at that time as to absorb it, till the end, the common right of all became confounded into the cultivated right of the individual. But there are nevertheless distinct species of rights, and will continue to be so long as the earth endures. It is only by tracing things to their origin that we can gain rightful ideas of them, and it is by gaining such ideas that we discover the boundary that divides right from wrong, that teaches every man to know his own. I have entitled this tract Agrarian Justice, to distinguish it from agrarian law. Nothing could be more unjust than agrarian law in a country improved by cultivation. For though every man, as an inhabitant of the earth, is a joint proprietor of it in its natural state, it does not follow that he is a joint proprietor of the cultivated earth. The additional value made by cultivation, after the system was admitted, became the property of those who did it, or who inherited it from them, or who purchased it. It had originally no owner. Therefore, I advocate the right and interest myself in the hard case of all those who had been thrown out of their natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property. I equally defend the right of the possessor to the part which is his. Cultivation is at least one of the greatest natural improvements ever made by human invention. It is given to created earth a tenfold value, but the landed monopoly that began with it has produced the greatest evil. It has dispossessed more than half the inhabitants of every nation of their natural inheritance without providing for them, as ought to have been done, an indemnification for that loss, and has thereby created a species of poverty and wretchedness that did not exist before. In advocating the case for the persons thus dispossessed, it is a right and not a charity that I am pleading for. But it is that kind of right which, being neglected at first, could not be brought forward afterwards till heaven had opened the way by a revolution in the system of government. Let us do honor to revolutions by justice, and give currency to their principles by blessings. Having thus in a few words opened the merits of the case, I shall now proceed to the plan I have to propose, which is to create a national fund, out of which there shall be paid to every person when arrived at the age of 21 years, a sum of £15 as compensation in part for the loss of his or her natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property, and also the sum of £10 per annum during life to every person now living of the age of 50 years, and to all others as they shall arrive at that age. I have already established the principle, namely, that the earth in its natural uncultivated state was, and ever would have continued to be, the common property of the human race. That, in that state, every person would have been born to property, and that the system of landed property, by its inseparable connection with cultivation and with what is called civilized life, has absorbed the property of all those whom it dispossessed, without providing, as it ought to have done, an indemnification for that loss. The fault, however, is not in the present possessors. No complaint is tended or ought to be alleged against them, unless they adopt the crime by opposing justice. The fault of this system, and it has stolen perceptibly upon the world, aided afterwards by the agrarian law of the sword. But the fault can be made to reform itself by successive generations, and without diminishing or deranging the property of any present possessors. The operation of the fund can commence in full activity the first year of its establishment, or soon after, as I shall show. It is proposed that the payments, as already stated, be made to every person, rich or poor. Therefore, it is best to make it so to prevent invidious distinctions. It is also right it should be so, because it is in lieu of natural inheritance, which, as a right, belongs to every man, over and above property he may have created or inherited from those who did. Such persons as do not choose to receive it can throw it into the common fund. Taking it then for granted that no person ought to be in a worse condition when born under what is called the state of civilization, that he would have been born in a state of nature, and that civilization ought to have been made and ought to still make provision for that purpose, it can be only done by the subtraction of property, a proportion equal in value to the natural inheritance it is absorbed. Various methods may be proposed for this purpose, but that which appears to be the best, not only because it will operate without deranging any present possessors, or without interfering with the collection of taxes or imposts necessary for the purposes of government and the revolution, but because it will be the least troublesome and the most effectual, and also because subtraction will be made at the time that best admits it, is at the moment that the property is passing by death of one person to the possession of another. In this case, the bequeather gives nothing, the receiver pays nothing. It is the only matter to him is the monopoly of natural inheritance, to which there never was a right, begins to cease in his person. A generous man would not wish it to continue, and a just man would rejoice to see it abolished. My state of health prevents my making sufficient inquiries with respect to the doctrine of probabilities, whereon to found calculations with such degrees of certainty as they are capable of. What therefore I offer on this head is more the result of observation and reflection than of received information. But I believe it will be found to agree sufficiently with fact. In the first place, taking 21 years as the epoch of maturity, all property of a nation, real and personal, is always in the possession of persons above that age. It is then necessary to know, as a datum of calculation, the average of years which persons above that age will live. I take this average to be about 30 years, for which many persons will live 40, 50, or 60 years after the age of 21 years. Others will die much sooner, and some every year of that time. Taking then 30 years the average time, it will give, without any material variation one way or the other, the average of time in which the whole property or capital of a nation, or a sum equal thereto, will have passed through one entire revolution in descent, that is, will have gone by deaths to new possessors, for though in many instances some parts of this capital will remain 40, 50, or 60 years in the possession of one person. Other parts will have revolved 2 or 3 times before those 30 years expire, which will bring it to that average. For where 1/2 the capital of a nation to revolve twice in 30 years, it would produce the same fund as if the whole revolved once. Taking then 30 years as the average of time in which the whole capital of a nation, or sum equal thereto, will revolve once, the 30th part thereof will be the sum that will revolve each year, that is, will go by the deaths to new possessors, and this last sum being thus known, and the ratio percent being subtracted from it determined, it will give the annual amount or income of the proposed fund to be applied as already mentioned. In looking over the discourse of the English minister Pitt in his opening of what is called in England the budget, the scheme of finance for the year 1796, I find an estimate of the national capital of that unity. As this estimate of national capital is prepared ready to my hand, I take it as a datum to act upon. When a calculation is made upon the known capital of any nation, combined with its population, it will serve as a scale for any other nation in proportion with its capital and population be more or less. I am more disposed to take this estimate of Mr. Pitt for the purpose of showing to that minister, upon his own calculation, how much better money might be employed than in wasting it, as he has done on the wild project of setting up Bourbon kings. What, in the name of heaven, are Bourbon kings to the people of England? It is better that the people have bread. Mr. Pitt states that the national capital of England, real and personal, to 1,300 million sterling, which is about 1/4 part of the national capital of France, including Belgium. The event of the last harvest of each country proves that the soil of France more productive than that of England, and that it can be better support 24 or 25 millions of inhabitants than that of England can 7 or 7.5 millions. The 30th part of this capital at I think that's, what is that? 1,300,000,000 pounds is 43,333,333, which is the part that will resolve each year by the deaths in that country to the new possessors, and that the sum will annually revolve in France in the proportion of 4:1, which will be about 173 million sterling. From this sum of 43,333,333 pounds annually revolving is to be subtracted from the value of natural inheritance absorbed in it, which perhaps in fair justice cannot be taken as less, and ought to be taken for more than the 10th part. It will always happen that a property thus revolving by deaths each year as part will descend in a direct line to sons and daughters, and the other part collaterally, and the proportion will be found to be 3:1. That is about 30 millions above the sum with descent to direct heirs, and the remaining sum of 413,333,333 pounds to more distant relations and in the part to strangers. Considering then that man is always related to society, that relationship will become comparatively greater in proportion as the next of kin is more distinct, it is therefore consistent with civilization to say that where there are no direct heirs, society will be heir to a part over and above the 10th part due to society. If this additional part be 5 to 10 to 12% in proportion as next of kin be nearer or more remote, so as to average with the escheats may fall, which ought to always go to society and not to the government, in addition to 10% more than produce the annual sum of 43,333 will be, and then he has a graph there, Having thus arrived at the annual amount of the proposed fund, I come to in the next place to speak of the population proportioned to this fund and to compare it with the uses to which the fund may be applied. The population, I mean that of England, does not exceed several millions and a half, and the number of persons above the age of 50 will in that case be about 400,000. There would not, however, be more than that number that would accept the proposed £10 sterling per annum, though they would be entitled to it. I have no idea it would be accepted by many persons who had a yearly income of £200 to £300 sterling. But as we often see instances of rich people falling into sudden poverty, even at the age of 60, they would always have the right of drawing all the arrears due to them. 4 millions, therefore, above the sum of £5,666,666 will be required for 400,000 aged persons at £10 sterling each. I come now to speak of the persons annually arriving at 21 years of age. If all the persons who died were above the age of 21 years, the number of persons arriving at that age must be equal to the annual number of deaths to keep the population stationary. But the greater part die under the age of 21. Therefore, the number of persons annually arriving at 21 will be less than half the number of deaths. The total number of deaths upon a population of 7 millions and a half will be about 222,000 annually. The number arriving at 21 years of age will be around 100,000. The whole number of these will not receive the proposed £15 for the reasons already mentioned, though, as in the former case, they would be entitled to it. Admitting then that a tenth part declined in receiving it, the amount would stand thus. He shows fund annually 5,666,000 to 400 in one area to 400,000 each persons at £10 sterling each. Is 4 million pounds to 90,000 persons of 21 years. £15 sterling each is 1,350,000 pounds. So you're reducing that to 5,350,000 pounds. Remains 316,666 pounds. There are in every country a number of blind and lame persons totally incapable of earning a livelihood. But as it will always happen, the greater number of blind persons will be among those who are above the age of 50 years. They will be provided for in that class. The remaining sum of the 316,666 pounds will provide for the lame and blind under that age at the same rate of £10 annually per person. Having now gone through all the necessary calculations and stated the particulars of the plan, I shall conclude with some observations. It is not charity, but a right, not bounty, but justice that I am pleading for. The present state of civilization is as odious as it is unjust. It is absolutely the opposite of what it should be, and it is necessary that a revolution should be made in it. That the contrast of affluence and wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like dead and living bodies chained together. Though I care as little about riches as any man, I am a friend to riches because they are capable of good. I care not how affluent some may be, provided none be miserable in consequence of it. But it is impossible to enjoy affluence with the felicity it is capable of being enjoyed, while so much misery is mingled in the scene. The sight of misery and the unpleasant sensations it suggests, which, though they may be suffocated, cannot be extinguished, are a greater drawback upon the felicity of affluence than the proposed 10% upon property is worth. He that would not give the one to get rid of the other has no charity, even for himself. There are in every country some magnificent charities established by individuals. It is, however, little that any individual can do when the whole extent of the misery is to be relieved is considered. He may satisfy his conscience, but not his heart. He may give all that he has, and it will all relieve but little. It is only by organizing civilization upon the principles to act as a system of pulleys that the whole weight of misery can be removed. The plan here proposed will reach the whole. It will immediately relieve and take out of view three classes of wretchedness: the blind, the lame, the aged poor. It will furnish the rising generation with the means to prevent their becoming poor. It will do this without deranging or interfering with national measures. To show that this will be the case, it is sufficient to observe that the operation and effect of this plan will, in all cases, be the same as if every individual were voluntarily to make his will and depose his property in the manner here proposed. It is justice and not charity that is the principle of the plan. In all great cases, it is necessary to have a principle more universally active than charity. And with respect to justice, it is not to be left to the choice of detached individuals whether they will do justice or not. Considering then the plan on the ground of justice, it ought to be the act of the whole growing spontaneously out of the principles of the revolution, and the reputation it ought to be national and not individual. A plan upon this principle would benefit the revolution by the energy that springs from the consciousness of justice. It would multiply also the national resources, like for property, like vegetation, increases by offsets. When a young couple begin the world, the difference is exceedingly great, whether they begin with nothing or begin with 15 pounds apiece. With this aid, they could buy a cow and the implements to cultivate a few acres of land. And instead of becoming burdens upon society, which is always the case where children are produced faster than they can be fed, it would be put in a way of becoming useful and profitable citizens. The national domains also would sell the better if pecuniary aids were provided to cultivate them in small lots. It is the practice of what has unjustly obtained the name of civilization, and the practice merits not be called either charity or policy, to make some provisions for persons becoming poor and wretched only at the time they become so. Would it not, even as a matter of economy, be far better to adopt the means of preventing their becoming poor? This can best be done by making every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years, an inheritor of something to begin with. The rugged face of society, checkered with the extremes of affluence and want, proves that some extraordinary violence has been committed upon it, and calls on justice to redress. The great mass of poor in countries are become a hereditary race, and it is next to impossible them to get out of that state themselves. It ought to be observed that this mass increases in all countries that are called civilized. More persons fall annually into it than get out of it. Though in a plan in which justice and humanity are the foundation of principles, interest ought not to be admitted into the calculation. Yet it is always of advantage to the establishment of any plan to show it beneficial as a matter of interest. The success of any proposed plan submitted to public consideration must finally depend upon the numbers interested in supporting it, united with the principles of justice. The plan proposed will benefit all without injuring any. It will consolidate the interests of the Republic with that of the individual. To the numerous class dispossessed of their natural inheritance by the system of landed property, it will act as national justice. To the persons dying, possessed of moderate fortunes, it will operate as a to their children, more beneficial than any sum of money paid into the fund. It will give to the accumulation of riches a degree of security that none of the old governments of Europe, now tottering on their foundations, can give. I do not suppose that more than one family in 10 in any of the countries in Europe has, when the head of the family dies, a clear property of £500 sterling. To all such, the plan is advantageous. That property would pay £50 into the fund, and if there were only 2 children under the age, they would receive the £15 each, £30 on coming of age, and be entitled to £10 a year after 50. It is far from the overgrown acquisition of property that the fund will support itself, and I know that the possessors of such property in England, though they would eventually be benefited by the protection of 9/10 of it, will exclaim against the plan. But without entering any inquiry how they came by that property, let them recollect that they have been the advocates of this war, and that Mr. Pitt has already laid on more new taxes to be raised annually upon the people of England, and that for supporting the disposition of Austria and the Bourbons and the liberties of France, they would pay annually all the sums proposed in this plan. I have made calculations stated in this plan, upon which is called personal, as well as upon landed property. The reason for making it upon land is already explained. The reason for taking personal property into the calculation is equally well founded, though on a different principle. Land, as before said, is the free gift of the Creator in common to the human race. Personal property is the effect of society, and it is impossible for an individual to acquire personal property without the aid of society, as it is for him to make the land originally. Separate an individual from society and give him an island or a continent to possess, and he cannot acquire personal property. He cannot be rich. So inseparably are the means connected with the end in all cases, where the former do not exist, the latter cannot be obtained. All accumulation, therefore, of personal property beyond what a man's own hands produce is derived to him by living in society, and he owes on every principle of justice, of gratitude, and of civilization a part of that accumulation back to society from whence the whole came. This is putting the matter on the general principle, and perhaps it is best to do so, for if we examine the case minutely, it can be found that the accumulation of personal property is, in many instances, the effect of paying too little for the labor that produced it, the consequence of which is that the working hand perishes in old age and the employer abounds in affluence. It is perhaps impossible to proportion exactly the price of labor to the profits it produces. It will also be said, as an apology for the injustice, that were a workman to receive an increase of wages daily, he would not save it against old age, nor be much better for it in the interim. Make then the society the treasurer to guard it for him in a common fund. For it is no reason that he might not make good use of it for himself, another should take it. The state of civilization that has prevailed throughout Europe is as unjust in its principle as it is horrid in its effects, and it is the consciousness of this, the apprehension that such a state cannot continue when once investigation begins in any country, that makes the possessors of property dread the idea of revolution. It is the hazard and not the principle of revolutions that retards the process. This being the case, it is necessary, as well for the protection of property as for the sake of justice and humanity, to form a system that, while it preserves one part of society from wretchedness, shall secure the other from depreciation. The superstitious awe, the enslaving reverence that formerly surrounded affluence, is passing away in all countries, and leaving the possessor of property to the convulsion of accidents. Where wealth and splendor, instead of fascinating the multitude, excite emotions of disgust, when, instead of drawing forth admiration, it is beheld as an insult on wretchedness, when the ostentatious appearance it makes serves call the right of it in question, the case of property becomes critical, and it is only in a system of justice that the possessor can contemplate security. To remove the danger, it is necessary to remove the antipathies, and this can only be done by making property productive of a national blessing, extending to each individual, by which the riches of one man above or shall increase the national fund in the same proportion, when it shall be seen that the prosperity of that fund depends on the prosperity of individuals. When the more riches a man acquires, the better it shall be for the general mass. It is then that antipathies will cease, that property shall be placed on a permanent basis of national interest and protection. I have no property in France to become subject to the plan I propose. What I have, which is not much, is in the United States of America. But I will pay £100 sterling towards this fund in France the instant it shall be established. I will pay the same sum England whenever a similar establishment shall take place in that country. The revolution in the state of civilization is the necessary companion of revolutions in the system of government. If a revolution in any country be from bad to good, or from good to bad, the state of what is called the civilization of in that country must be made conformable thereto to give that revolution effect. Despotic governments supports itself by abject civilization, in which the debasement of the human mind and the wretchedness in the mass of the people are the chief criterions. Such governments consider man merely as an animal, and the exercise of the intellectual faculty is not his privilege, that he has nothing to do with the laws but to obey them, and they politically depend more upon breaking the spirit of the people by poverty than they fear enraging it by desperation. It is a revolution in the state of civilization that will give perfection to the revolution in France. Already the conviction that government by representation is a true system of government is spreading itself fast in the world. The reasonableness of it can be seen by all. The justiceness of it makes itself felt even by its opposers. But when a system of civilization growing out of that system of government shall be so organized that not a man or woman born in the Republic but shall inherit some means of beginning in the world, and see before them the certainty of escaping the miseries that under other governments accompany old age, the Revolution of France will have an advocate and an ally in the heart of all nations. The army of principles will penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. It will succeed where diplomatic management would fail. It is neither the Rhine, the Channel, nor the ocean that can arrest its progress. It will march on the horizon of the world, and it will conquer. Each canton, means for carrying the proposed plan into execution and to render it at the same time conducive to public interest. Each canton shall elect in its primary assemblies 3 persons as commissioners for that canton, who shall take cognizance and keep a register of all matters happening in that canton, conformable to the charter that shall be established by law for carrying this plan into execution. The law shall fix the manner in which the property of deceased persons shall be asserted. Number 3, the amount of the property of any deceased persons shall be ascertained. The principal heir to that property, the eldest of the co-heirs, if of lawful age, or if underage, the person authorized by the will of the deceased shall represent him or them, shall give bond to the commissioners of the canton, and pay the said 10th part thereof in 4 equal quarterly payments within the 1 within the space of 1 year or sooner, at the choice of the payers. One half of the whole property shall remain as a security until the bond be paid off. Number 4, the bond shall be registered in the office of the commissionaires of the canton, and the original bond shall be deposited in the National Bank of Paris. The bank shall publish each quarter of a year, and the amount of the bonds in its possession, and also the bonds that have been paid off, or what parts thereof since the last quarterly publication. The National Bank shall issue bank notes upon the securities of the bonds in its possession. The notes so issued shall be applied to pay the pensions of aged persons and the compensation to the persons arriving at 21 years of age. It is both reasonable and generous to suppose that persons not under immediate necessity will suspend their right of drawing on the fund until it acquire, as it will do, the greater degree of ability. In this case, it is proposed that an honorary register be kept in each canton of the names of the persons thus suspending that right, at least during the present war. Number, I guess that was 5, this is 6. As the inheritors of the property must always take up their bonds in 4 quarterly payments, or sooner if they choose, there will always be numerary arriving at the bank after the expiration of the first quarter to exchange for the bank notes that shall be brought in. 7. The bank notes shall be thus put into circulation upon the best of all possible security, that of actual property, to more than 4 times the amount of bonds upon which the notes are issued, and with the numerary continually arriving at the bank to exchange or pay them off wherever they shall be presented for that purpose. They will acquire the permanent value in all parts of the Republic. There can therefore be received in the government taxes equumps equal to numerary, because the government can always receive numerary from them at the bank. Number 8, it will be necessary that the payments of the 10% be made in numerary for the first year from the establishment of the plan, but after the expiration of the first year, the inheritors of property may pay 10% either in banknotes issued upon the fund. If the payments in numerary, it will lie deposited in the bank and be exchanged for the quantity of notes equal to that amount, and if notes issued upon the fund, it will cause a demand upon the fund thereto, and thus the operation of the plan will create the means to carry itself to execution. Thomas Paine, Agrarian Justice. Thank you for watching.